The mahogany conference table gleamed under the fluorescent lights of Davidson & Associates' 32nd floor boardroom, where Boston's financial district sprawled below us, like a testament to the old boys network that still controlled most of the city's major investment firms. At 34, I'd clawed my way from junior analyst to senior portfolio manager through 12 years of 18-hour days, weekend client meetings, and consistently outperforming every male colleague who'd been fast-tracked past me, despite bringing in half the revenue I generated annually. But as I sat in my usual seat at what I'd learned was apparently the women's end of the table, listening to my managing director, Richard Davidson III, dismiss my contribution to the firm's most lucrative client relationship, I realized that no amount of success would ever earn me the respect that mediocre men received simply by virtue of their gender and family connections. The quarterly board meeting that would shatter my remaining illusions about workplace equality had been called to discuss the renewal of our contract with Meridian Holdings, a $2.3 billion investment fund that represented nearly 40% of our firm's annual revenue. What the 12 men seated around the conference table didn't know, what Richard had apparently forgotten in his eagerness to claim credit for the account, was that I had built this client relationship from scratch over the past 4 years, starting with a cold call to their CFO that had bloomed into a partnership that had made Davidson & Associates one of Boston's most profitable mid-size investment firms. Richard Davidson III had inherited his position as managing director from his father, who had inherited the firm from his father, creating a dynasty of mediocrity that had somehow survived 3 generations of financial markets through a combination of family connections and the talent of employees who actually understood modern investment strategies. At 52, Richard possessed the kind of Ivy League arrogance that mistook inherited privilege for earned expertise, and he'd spent the past 2 years taking credit for client relationships that had been built by associates and senior managers who lacked the family name to challenge his narrative about who deserved recognition for the firm's success. The Meridian Holdings account had been my baby from its inception, requiring months of research into their investment philosophy, late-night strategy sessions to align our services with their long-term goals, and countless hours of relationship building with their executive team, who had specifically requested to work with me rather than the firm's senior partners. My innovative approach to alternative investment strategies had helped Meridian achieve returns that consistently outperformed market benchmarks, while my quarterly performance reports had become templates that other firms tried to copy for their own high-net-worth clients. But, in Richard's version of events, which he'd been recounting to the board with increasing embellishment over the past 20 minutes, the Meridian relationship was the result of his strategic vision and personal networking, rather than my technical expertise and relationship management skills. Gentlemen, I'm pleased to report that my cultivation of the Meridian Holdings partnership has resulted in another record quarter, he announced with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his right to claim credit for other people's work. My innovative investment approach and personal relationship with their executive team continues to generate exceptional returns that position our firm as a leader in the Boston market. As Richard continued his fictional account of how he'd single-handedly built and maintained our most important client relationship, I felt the familiar burn of watching my professional achievements be systematically erased and reassigned to someone whose primary qualification was sharing a last name with the company founder. The board members nodded approvingly at his presentation, apparently unaware that the man they were congratulating couldn't distinguish between a growth stock and a value play, without consulting the research notes that I'd been preparing for him every quarter for the past 4 years. The breaking point came when board member Thomas Hartwell asked about the specific investment strategies that had generated such impressive returns for Meridian Holdings, and Richard's response revealed the depth of his ignorance about the account he'd been claiming as his personal achievement. The key to our success has been implementing traditional blue-chip investment approaches while maintaining conservative risk management protocols, he said, with authoritative confidence that would have been impressive if it weren't completely wrong about every aspect of the portfolio I'd designed and managed for 4 years. I watched in horrified fascination as Richard described an investment philosophy that was the exact opposite of the innovative alternative strategies that had actually generated Meridian's exceptional returns, including their groundbreaking investments in emerging market currencies, technology sector derivatives, and sustainable energy funds that I'd researched and recommended against the firm's traditional conservative approach. His fictional account of conservative protocols would have been laughable if the board weren't taking notes and nodding as if they were receiving valuable insights into successful client management. Board member Patricia Wells asked the follow-up question that would expose Richard's complete disconnect from the reality of our most important client relationship. Richard, how do you maintain such close communication with Meridian's executive team? They seem remarkably satisfied with our services compared to their previous investment partners. Her innocent inquiry would have been easy to answer honestly, since Meridian's executives communicated almost exclusively with me, and had specifically mentioned in several emails that they appreciated having a dedicated point of contact who understood their portfolio's complexity. Richard's pause before answering revealed that he was struggling to fabricate details about client interactions that had never actually occurred, but his response demonstrated the breathtaking arrogance that allowed him to claim ownership of relationships he'd never participated in. Patricia, I've found that maintaining personal connections through regular golf games and social events creates the kind of trust that translates into long-term business partnerships, he said, with the confidence of someone who apparently believed that client management happened exclusively at country clubs, rather than through technical expertise and professional service delivery. The irony of Richard's explanation was that Meridian's CFO, Marcus Chen, was a detail-oriented former MIT professor who had explicitly told me that he preferred working with investment managers who understood quantitative analysis rather than relationship managers who relied on social networking to compensate for lack of technical knowledge. Marcus had specifically praised my quarterly reports for their sophisticated risk assessment models and innovative diversification strategies, calling them the most comprehensive portfolio analysis we've ever received from an investment firm. As Richard continued weaving his fantasy about golf course client management and social networking success, I realized that he genuinely believed his own fiction about how modern investment relationships functioned, apparently unaware that today's sophisticated clients demanded expertise and performance rather than cocktail party charm. His presentation to the board was revealing not just his ignorance about our most important account, but his fundamental misunderstanding of what had made our firm successful in an increasingly competitive market where technical competence mattered more than family connections. The moment that would change everything arrived when board member James Morrison asked about the upcoming contract renewal with Meridian Holdings, and Richard's response revealed that he had no understanding of the specific terms, expectations, or timeline that I'd been negotiating with their executive team for the past 3 months. James, I'm confident that Meridian will continue to appreciate the personal attention and conservative investment approach that has characterized our partnership, Richard said with his usual vague authority, apparently unaware that the contract renewal was contingent on our firm's ability to meet specific performance benchmarks and expand into international markets that required expertise he didn't possess. I had spent countless hours over the past quarter developing the proposal that would secure Meridian's contract renewal, including detailed projections for European Union investment opportunities, analysis of Asian market volatility, and recommendations for cryptocurrency integration that reflected their interest in diversifying beyond traditional asset classes. The 127-page proposal sitting in my briefcase represented months of research and strategic planning that Richard had never reviewed, despite the fact that Meridian's renewal decision would determine whether our firm remained profitable or faced significant layoffs. When Morrison pressed for specific details about the renewal timeline and terms, Richard made the fatal mistake of turning to me with the kind of casual dismissal that revealed exactly how he viewed my role in what he considered his client relationship. Sarah, why don't you update the board on the administrative details while I handle the strategic overview? He said with the condescending tone that successful men used when addressing women they considered glorified secretaries. You're just here to take notes anyway, so you can fill everyone in on the paperwork aspects while I focus on the bigger picture. The silence that followed Richard's dismissal of my role was deafening, as board members processed what they'd just heard. The managing director had essentially told his senior portfolio manager, in front of the company's governing body, that her function was limited to note-taking and administrative support for an account that she'd obviously been intimately involved in developing. Patricia Wells looked genuinely shocked by Richard's casual sexism, while Morrison's expression suggested he was beginning to understand that there might be significant discrepancies between Richard's claims about client management and the reality of who was actually doing the work. But Richard's obliviousness to the impact of his words was complete, as he settled back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he'd efficiently delegated minor details to support staff while maintaining focus on important strategic considerations. Sarah's been very helpful with the routine correspondence and data entry aspects of the Meridian relationship, he added with patronizing approval, apparently thinking he was being generous by acknowledging my existence, while simultaneously reducing 4 years of sophisticated portfolio management to clerical work. The fury that rose in my chest was unlike anything I'd experienced in my professional career, as I realized that Richard's dismissal wasn't just about this moment. It was a perfect encapsulation of how he'd been viewing and characterizing my contributions throughout our working relationship. Every innovative strategy I'd developed, every client relationship I'd built, every market analysis that had generated millions in revenue had been filtered through his assumption that women in finance were inherently limited to support roles, while men handled the important decision-making responsibilities. As I sat in the stunned silence that followed Richard's casual destruction of my professional identity, I felt a strange calm settling over me as the clarity of my situation became undeniable. The 12 years I'd spent building expertise, developing client relationships, and generating revenue for Davidson and Associates had been systematically attributed to men who possessed neither the knowledge nor the competence to replicate my success. The recognition I'd been working toward would never come, because Richard and his board genuinely believed that women were incapable of the strategic thinking that drove successful investment management. Reaching into my briefcase, I removed 2 envelopes that I'd prepared 3 weeks earlier, after Marcus Chen from Meridian Holdings had made a casual comment about wishing he could work directly with me, rather than having to coordinate through intermediaries who don't understand the technical aspects of our portfolio. The first envelope contained my resignation letter, written with the precision and thoroughness that characterized all my professional communications. The second envelope contained documents that would demonstrate exactly who had been responsible for the client relationships and revenue generation that had kept Davidson and Associates profitable. "Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence with calm authority that made everyone at the table turn their attention toward me. "Since you've clarified that my role here is limited to note-taking and administrative support, I think it's time for me to pursue opportunities where my actual qualifications and experience will be properly valued." As I placed my resignation letter on the mahogany table, I could see confusion beginning to replace condescension in Richard's expression, as he apparently hadn't expected any consequences for his public humiliation of his senior portfolio manager. The second document I produced would shatter every assumption the board had made about the source of their firm's recent success and the sustainability of their most important client relationships. "This is a summary of my client portfolio," I announced, spreading the papers across the table where everyone could see the detailed breakdown of accounts, revenue figures, and relationship management responsibilities that revealed the true scope of my contributions to the firm's profitability. As you can see, I've been the primary relationship manager for accounts representing 67% of our firm's annual revenue, including our complete management of the Meridian Holdings partnership. The gasps from several board members revealed that they'd been unaware of how much of their firm's success depended on the woman Richard had just dismissed as a note-taker, while Patricia Wells leaned forward to examine the client data with the expression of someone who was beginning to understand the magnitude of what they were witnessing. "Sarah, this shows that you've been managing almost all of our major accounts," she said with growing alarm in her voice. "How is it possible that the board wasn't aware of your central role in our client relationships?" But the most devastating revelation was still to come, as I produced the final document that would demonstrate the immediate consequences of Richard's assumption that client loyalty belonged to the firm, rather than to the individual professionals who had earned it through competence and service. "Actually, Patricia, there's something else the board should know about client relationships and professional transitions," I said, holding up a letter that bore the official letterhead of Meridian Holdings. "This is a notice from Marcus Chen, informing Davidson and Associates that Meridian Holdings will be terminating their contract with this firm effective immediately, as they've decided to follow their primary portfolio manager to her new position at Blackstone Financial." The explosion of voices around the conference table was immediate and chaotic, as board members processed the fact that their most profitable client was leaving with the employee they'd just watched their managing director dismiss as administrative support. Richard's face had gone completely white as he stared at the Meridian Holdings termination letter, apparently trying to understand how his most important client relationship had disappeared in the span of a 5-minute conversation. "That's impossible," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction even as he spoke the words. Meridian has been with our firm for years. They can't just terminate a major investment contract because of personnel changes. But the reality of modern client relationships in investment management was something Richard had never bothered to understand, despite his inherited position overseeing a firm that depended entirely on personal trust and professional competence rather than institutional loyalty. Richard, sophisticated clients like Meridian don't invest with firms. They invest with the specific professionals who understand their portfolio and deliver results. I explained with the patience of someone teaching basic concepts to a student who'd been promoted beyond his comprehension level. When Marcus Chen wanted quarterly reports, he called me directly. When they needed market analysis, they requested my research specifically. The relationship was never with Davidson and Associates. It was with me. Patricia Wells was frantically reviewing the client data I'd provided, apparently calculating the financial implications of losing nearly 70% of their revenue, while several other board members looked like they might be physically ill as they processed the magnitude of the crisis Richard's sexism had created for their firm. "Sarah, how many other clients are likely to follow you to Blackstone?" she asked, with the desperate tone of someone who was beginning to understand that this wasn't just about one account, but about the potential collapse of their entire business model. The question about client defections opened the door for me to reveal the full scope of what Davidson and Associates was losing through their systematic undervaluation of the woman who'd been generating their profits while men took credit for her work. "Patricia, I've received calls from representatives of Wellington Industries, Coastal Maritime Holdings, and the Pemberton Family Trust expressing interest in moving their accounts to whatever firm I join," I said, watching the color drain from additional faces around the table. "These clients have specifically stated that they prefer working with me rather than with Davidson and Associates as an institution." Morrison was now frantically taking notes as he apparently tried to calculate whether their firm could survive the loss of the clients who'd been specifically requesting to work with me rather than with the male partners who'd been claiming credit for relationship management they'd never actually performed. "This is a disaster," he muttered. Though whether he was referring to the financial implications or the revelation that their firm's success had been built on the work of someone they'd been systematically excluding from recognition and advancement was unclear. Richard's attempt to maintain his authority in the face of complete professional humiliation was both pathetic and revealing of his continued inability to understand what had just happened to his inherited business empire. "You can't just steal our clients because you're upset about a misunderstanding during a board meeting," he said with desperate indignation, apparently believing that client relationships belonged to him by virtue of his family name, rather than being earned through competence and trust. "Those accounts represent years of relationship building and strategic planning that you can't just walk away with because your feelings got hurt." His characterization of systematic sexism and credit theft as hurt feelings was the final confirmation I needed that leaving Davidson and Associates was not just the right decision, but the only decision that would allow me to build a career based on merit, rather than constantly fighting for recognition of achievements that would be attributed to less qualified men, regardless of evidence or results. As the board meeting devolved into panicked discussions about damage control and client retention strategies, I gathered my resignation documents and prepared to leave Davidson and Associates for the last time, knowing that my departure would force them to confront the reality that their recent success had been built on the expertise of someone they'd never valued appropriately. "Before I go," I said, addressing the room full of men who were frantically trying to figure out how to manage client relationships they'd never actually understood, "you should know that Marcus Chen specifically mentioned that Meridian's decision to terminate was based on their concern that Davidson and Associates doesn't properly recognize or compensate the professionals who generate results. The implication that their sexist treatment of senior female employees had become known to their most important clients sent another wave of panic through the boardroom, as members realized that this crisis extended beyond just financial losses to potential reputation damage throughout Boston's investment community." Patricia Wells looked genuinely angry as she processed the fact that the firm's discriminatory practices had been exposed to clients whose respect they needed to maintain their market position. "How many other clients are aware of our internal personnel issues?" she asked, with the tone of someone who was beginning to understand that their problems extended far beyond immediate account losses. Richard's final attempt to salvage his authority revealed the depth of his delusion about his importance to the firm's operations and his role in client relationship management. We'll contact Meridian directly and explain that there's been a personnel misunderstanding that can be resolved through proper negotiation," he announced with the confidence of someone who still believed that his family connections and inherited position carried more weight than demonstrated competence and established trust. "I'm sure Marcus Chen will reconsider once we clarify the administrative nature of any staff transitions and assure him of continuity in our strategic approach." But my response would shatter his remaining illusions about client loyalty and the transferability of professional relationships in modern investment management. "Richard, Marcus Chen specifically asked me to give you a message," I said, producing a handwritten note from my briefcase that would deliver the final blow to his ego and his understanding of how his business actually functioned. "He wanted me to tell you that Meridian Holdings has never considered you to be involved in their account management, and that they were surprised to learn that you've been claiming credit for portfolio strategies that you've never reviewed or approved." The handwritten note from Marcus Chen was brief, but devastating in its assessment of Richard's competence and involvement in the client relationship he'd been claiming as his personal achievement. "Please inform Mr. Davidson that our decision to terminate our contract is final, and that we have no interest in discussing account retention with someone who has demonstrated no understanding of our portfolio or investment objectives. We look forward to continuing our professional relationship with Ms. Thompson at Blackstone Financial." As I walked toward the conference room door for the last time, leaving behind 12 years of fighting for recognition in a firm that would never value competence over connections, I felt a liberation that was worth more than any promotion or partnership they could have offered. The men who'd spent years taking credit for my work were now facing the consequences of their assumption that client relationships belonged to the firm rather than to the professionals who'd earned them through expertise and trust. The woman who'd been told she was just here to take notes was walking away with the clients, the relationships, and the reputation that she'd built through her own merit, leaving behind a firm that would finally have to confront the reality that their success had been dependent on someone they'd never bothered to properly value. Sometimes the best revenge isn't proving people wrong. It's letting them discover exactly what they've lost when they can no longer take credit for someone else's achievements